The wind was a lonely voice on the Nebraska prairie, a constant mourner that swept across the grasslands with a sound like a sigh. It was the only voice Alara Vincent had consistently heard for 5 years. It whispered through the eaves of the Black Creek way station, rattled the single pane of glass in the window, and scoured the weathered wood of the cabin until it was the same pale gray as a winter sky. The silence inside was a different entity altogether. It was a heavy, curated thing, built from the rigid architecture of routine. Alara's days were measured by tasks, not time. The morning began with the scrape of a metal bucket against the stones of the well, its rope coarse against her calloused palms. It proceeded with the aggressive scrubbing of floors with lye soap, the scent of which seemed to sanitize the very air of memory. Afternoons were for mending the station's linens, her stitches small and brutally precise, leaving no room for a stray thought. She tended the stables, forked hay into empty stalls meant for stagecoach horses that rarely came anymore, and polished the brass lantern hooks until they gleamed with a light no one was there to see. Each task was a brick in the wall she had built around her heart, a fortress against the day Samuel and 4-year-old Leo had ridden the morning stagecoach into town for supplies and never returned. The memory of the wreckage, a splintered collage of wood and leather just a mile down the creek bed, was a place her mind was forbidden to visit. She kept it at bay with the sheer, monotonous force of her will. The way station, once their shared dream, had become her penance. She did not live here, she kept watch over her tomb. On this late autumn afternoon, the wind's voice held a sharper edge. The sky to the northwest was the color of a fresh bruise, and the air carried the metallic scent of imminent snow. Alara secured the shutters on the main building, her movements economical, her gaze sweeping the horizon out of habit. Nothing. The trail stretching east and west was an empty ribbon of brown thread stitched across an endless quilt of ambergrass. She felt a familiar, bitter relief. Solitude was safety. She retreated to the main room of her small living quarters, a space as sparse and scrubbed as a monastery cell. A fire crackled low in the stone hearth, its warmth doing little to touch the chill that lived permanently in her bones. She sat at the rough-hewn table, a cup of weak, bitter coffee in her hands, and stared at the opposite wall. 2 pale rectangles on the log wall marked where Samuel's rifle and Leo's crayon drawings had once hung. She had taken them down years ago, unable to bear their silent testimony. The emptiness was easier. Emptiness was a void. Memories were ghosts with sharp edges. The first flakes of snow began to drift past the window, lazy and fat. The coming blizzard would be a bad one. It would cut her off completely, cocooning her in a world of white. She welcomed it. The snow would muffle the world, deepen the silence, and for a few days, she could pretend nothing existed beyond these walls. That is why the sound, when it came, was so jarring. It was a sharp, frantic knocking, a sound of such desperate urgency it seemed to tear through the very fabric of the silence she had so carefully woven. For a moment, Alara froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. It had to be the wind, a branch thrown against the door. No one came to Black Creek anymore, not since the new rail line had been laid 30 miles to the south. The knocking came again, louder this time, accompanied by a muffled shout that was swallowed by the rising storm. It was a human sound, a sound of trouble. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore it, to let the wind and snow handle the intrusion. Her world was balanced on a knife's edge of control. A single unexpected variable could send it toppling. But then a different sound reached her. A thin, high wail, like a terrified animal. A child. The sound pierced the wall around her heart with the force of a physical blow. It was the sound of a child in distress, a sound she had not allowed herself to hear even in memory for 5 years. The coffee cup trembled in her hand. "Don't," she told herself. "It's not your concern. You can't." She stood, her chair scraping against the floorboards. The ghost of the nurse she had once been, the shadow of the mother she would have been, rose up against her will. She moved to the door, her hand hovering over the heavy iron bolt. Opening this door was a choice. It was an act of letting the world, with all its pain and chaos, back in. With a shuddering breath that felt like a surrender, she slid the bolt back and pulled the heavy door inward. The wind tore at her, throwing a blast of snow and frigid air into the room. On her porch stood 2 figures, huddled together against the storm. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, was slumped against the doorframe, his face a ghastly, ashen color. His shirt was a dark, sodden mess of crimson against the white snow dusting his shoulders. He leaned heavily on the small boy beside him, and it was this detail that made Alara's blood run cold. A single, heavy iron chain ran from the man's right wrist to the boy's left. The boy couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. His face was pale with cold and terror, his eyes huge and dark in the failing light. He shivered violently, not just from the wind, but from the strain of holding the much larger man upright. The man's head lifted, his gaze finding hers. His eyes were bleary with pain, his breathing a ragged, shallow rasp. "Please," he rasped, the word a plume of white in the freezing air. "The boy, he'll freeze." Alara's mind, trained by years of battlefield nursing, took in the scene with detached, clinical precision. The man was severely wounded, likely a gunshot, and well on his way to bleeding out. The boy was suffering from exposure and shock. The chain was an aberration, a symbol of something deeply wrong. But the immediate threat was the storm. To leave them on the porch was to sentence them both to death. Her resolve, her 5 years of carefully guarded solitude, crumbled. "Get inside," she said, her voice rough from disuse. She took some of the man's weight herself, helping the boy guide him over the threshold. He was heavier than he looked, his body a dead weight against hers. As he stumbled into the room, he collapsed, his fall cushioned only by Alara's desperate effort to break it. He lay on the floor, unconscious, a dark pool already beginning to form beneath him on the clean floorboards. The boy stood over him, still chained, his small body trembling uncontrollably. His gaze darted around the stark room, finally settling on Alara with an expression of pure, animal terror. He looked from her to the unconscious man, and then to the door, which was still open to the storm. Alara pushed the door shut against the howling wind. The heavy thud of the bolt sliding home echoed in the sudden, ringing silence. They were sealed in, the 3 of them, strangers, bound together by a storm, a wound, and a length of cold, unyielding iron. The quiet, empty world of Alara Vincent was no more. Outside, the world dissolved into a maelstrom of white. The blizzard did not just fall, it attacked, throwing itself against the small outpost with a fury that seemed personal. Wind screamed through the cracks in the log walls, a sound like a soul in torment. Snow piled in drifts against the door and windows, burying them, isolating them, erasing the trail and any hope of the outside world intervening. Inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was being weathered, one of quiet, desperate focus. The sight of the Marshal's blood pooling on her meticulously scrubbed floor had broken through the last of Alara's frozen inertia. The part of her that had been Nurse Vincent on the battlefields of Shiloh and Antietam, a part she had tried to bury alongside her husband, rose from its shallow grave. It took command with an authority that left no room for grief or fear. Her first challenge was the chain. It was a cruel, heavy thing, linking the unconscious man to the terrified child. She had no key, and the iron was too thick for any tool she possessed. Working around it, she managed to get a knife and cut away the Marshal's blood-stiffened shirt. The wound was worse than she had feared. It was a ragged hole in his left shoulder, puckered and inflamed, the flesh around it an angry, purplish red. It smelled of fever and infection. He was burning up, his skin hot and dry to the touch. "Water," she said, her voice a low command aimed at herself. She moved with a purpose she had not felt in years, stoking the fire, hanging a kettle of water to boil. She found her old medical satchel tucked away in a dusty trunk, a relic from another lifetime. The leather was cracked, but the instruments inside were clean, and the scent of carbolic acid that rose from it was the scent of purpose. As she worked, cleaning the wound with boiled water and a tincture of willow bark, the Marshal began to mutter. His words slurred and disjointed, churned up from the depths of his fever. "Silas, the land, can't let him have the boy." Alara focused on her work, her hands steady as she packed the wound with a poultice of comfrey and yarrow. But the words slipped past her defenses, planting seeds of confusion. "No, not a prisoner," he groaned, his head thrashing against the rolled blanket she had placed beneath it. "The boy, he's the witness. Protect the witness." "Witness!" The word snagged in her mind. She glanced at the boy, who had not moved from his spot near the hearth. He was a small, still statue of terror, his eyes tracking her every movement. He was still chained to this man, a man who claimed in his delirium not to be his captor, but his protector. The contradiction was a knot she could not untangle. For hours, she fought the fever. She forced spoonfuls of cool water and willow bark tea between the Marshal's cracked lips, bathed his forehead with damp cloths, and listened to the ragged rhythm of his breathing. The storm outside raged on, its fury a constant, roaring counterpoint to the quiet, desperate battle for life within the cabin walls. When she had done all she could for the man, she turned her attention to the boy. He had not made a sound. He just sat, shivering, his small frame radiating a fear so profound it was almost a physical presence in the room. "You must be hungry," Alara said softly, approaching him as one would a frightened deer. He flinched, pulling back, the chain rattling against the floorboards. She stopped, holding up her hands in a gesture of peace. "I won't hurt you," she said. "I'm here to help." She ladled some of the venison stew she had made for her own supper into a bowl and placed it on the floor, a safe distance from him. The savory aroma filled the room, but the boy made no move. His gaze was fixed on the Marshal, his small face a mask of worry. Alara saw then what he was clutching in his free hand, held tight against his chest like a holy relic. It was a small bird, crudely carved from a piece of pine, but rendered with a loving detail that suggested a skilled, patient hand. Its left wing was broken, snapped clean off at the joint. The sight of that small, broken thing resonated deep within Alara. She understood. Without a word, she rose and went to the large trunk that held Samuel's things. From the bottom, beneath his folded uniform and the books he had loved, she retrieved a small wooden box. It held his whittling tools, his pot of pine resin glue, and a collection of half-finished projects. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The scent of cedar and Samuel filled her senses for a painful moment. She pushed the grief down, focusing on the task. She returned to the hearth and sat on the floor, not far from the boy. She did not look at him or speak to him. She simply opened the box, took out the glue pot, and warmed it by the fire. Then, she picked up a tiny sliver of wood and, with the focused precision of a surgeon, began to mend the bird's broken wing. The boy watched, his dark eyes following the delicate movements of her fingers as she applied the warm glue and carefully set the wing back in place. She held it there, patient and still, until the resin cooled and hardened. The bird was whole again. She placed the mended bird on the floor between them and pushed it gently toward him. He stared at it for a long moment, then at her. His lower lip trembled. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and picked it up, running a small thumb over the repaired wing. Alara rose and retrieved the bowl of stew, which had grown cool. She knelt and offered it to him again. This time, he took it. He ate with the ravenous hunger of a child who had not known when his next meal would be, his eyes never leaving her face. When he was finished, he curled up on the bearskin rug by the fire, the mended bird held safely in his hand, and finally, mercifully, fell asleep. The chain lay coiled on the floor, a strange, metallic umbilical cord that still connected him to the wounded man. Alara kept her vigil through the night. The blizzard howled its desolate song, and the fire cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. She looked at the two strangers who had shattered her solitude. The lawman, muttering about witnesses and protection. The silent boy, who had only begun to trust her after she had mended something broken. The silence of her home was gone, replaced by the sound of their breathing and the ceaseless voice of the storm. A storm had breached her walls, both inside and out, and Alara Vincent knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and profound, that nothing would ever be the same. The storm exhausted itself on the third morning. The wind's tormented howl softened to a low, mournful whisper, and then fell silent. In its wake, it left a world remade, a landscape of profound and intimidating beauty. Alara stood at the small window, looking out at a sea of unbroken white that stretched to a horizon of impossible, brilliant blue. The sun, dazzling on the fresh snow, made the world look clean, pure, and utterly empty. The outpost was no longer on the prairie. It was an island adrift in a silent, frozen ocean, their isolation now absolute. The silence inside the cabin was different, too. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of grief, but the hushed, expectant silence of a sick room. Sometime before dawn, the Marshal's fever had broken. Alara had felt it in the subtle shift of the air around him. The moment his skin, once radiating a dry, scorching heat, became cool and damp to the touch. The ragged, shallow breaths that had worried her for 2 days had deepened into the slow, even rhythm of genuine sleep. She was changing the dressing on his wound when his eyes opened. They were no longer the wild, unfocused eyes of a man lost in delirium. They were clear, startlingly blue, and filled with a weary, assessing intelligence. He watched her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her steady hands, the clean bandage, and the small boy sleeping soundly by the hearth, still chained to his wrist. "My thanks, ma'am," he said, his voice a dry, hoarse whisper. "You saved my life." "I'm a nurse," Alara replied simply, though she had not called herself one in 5 years. "It's what I do, or what I did." She secured the bandage and offered him a dipper of water, which he drank thirstily. "Where?" he began, his eyes moving to the snow-choked window. "Black Creek Way Station. The blizzard has you sealed in tight. You've been here 2 nights. She met his gaze directly, the questions she had been holding at bay rising to the surface. "You spoke in your fever. You called the boy a witness." The Marshal's expression tightened. He looked over at Daniel, a flicker of profound sorrow in his eyes. He slowly, painfully, pushed himself up to a sitting position, leaning his good shoulder against the wall. "My name is Elias Vance. I'm a U.S. Marshal." He paused, gathering his strength. "And you're right, the boy is a witness." Alara waited, her hands folded in her lap. The fragments she had overheard now began to coalesce into a terrifying shape. "His name is Daniel Miller," Elias said, his voice barely more than a whisper. 2 weeks ago, he had a mother, a father, and a baby sister. They were homesteaders up on the Powder River. Good land, with the only reliable water source for 20 miles. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if the memory were a physical pain. "A man named Silas Kane wants that land. He's a cattle baron, building an empire. He tried to buy them out. When they refused, he brought his men. They rode in at dusk. They murdered Daniel's father in the barn, his mother and the baby in the house. They burned everything to the ground." Alara felt a cold dread seep into her bones. Her gaze went to Daniel, sleeping in the innocent curl of childhood, and she imagined a horror so profound it had stolen his voice. "How did he survive?" she asked, her own voice a whisper. "He was in the root cellar, fetching preserves for his mother. He heard the shots, the screams. He stayed hidden, buried himself under old potato sacks. He was there for 2 days before I found him." The Marshal's voice broke on the last words. He hasn't spoken a word since. The story hung in the air between them, stark and brutal. It resonated with the echoes of Alara's own tragedy, a family destroyed in a moment of senseless violence. The abstract duty she had felt as a nurse sharpened into a fierce, protective ache. This boy, this silent, broken child, had lost everything, just as she had. "And the chain?" she asked, her voice hardening. "If you're protecting him, why is he chained to you like a prisoner?" Elias looked down at the heavy iron on his wrist, a deep shame settling over his features. "That was a mistake born of desperation," he said. "After I got Daniel clear, I was taking him to the federal courthouse in Fort Laramie. His testimony is the only thing that can bring Kane to justice. But Kane's men are everywhere. They ambushed us 2 days before we reached you. That's where I got this." He gestured to his wounded shoulder. "They weren't trying to kill me. Not then. They were after the boy. I fought them off, but I knew they'd be back. I knew they'd be watching the towns, the trails. They were looking for a marshal traveling with a small boy. A witness." He took a ragged breath. "So I did the only thing I could think of to hide him in plain sight. I made him a prisoner, a marshal transporting a juvenile delinquent. It's a common enough sight. It's an interesting. Kane's men would look right past us. They wouldn't risk interfering with a federal transport, not for a common thief." The desperate, brilliant logic of the ruse stunned Alara into silence. He had chained Daniel to himself not to imprison him, but to make him invisible, to protect him with the one thing his enemies wouldn't question: the appearance of authority and lawful capture. "I was trying to make it to the fort, but the wound in the storm, we got lost," Elias finished, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We saw your light. It was our last hope." The truth, now that it was revealed, settled into the room with an undeniable weight. Alara looked from the honorable, wounded man leaning against her wall to the small, silent boy sleeping by the fire. Her life of carefully maintained emptiness was a luxury they could not afford. Her grief was a wall, but their need was a flood that had already breached it. She thought of Leo, of his bright laughter and the crayon drawings that had once decorated the walls. She had lost her son to a cruel accident of fate. Daniel had lost his family to the deliberate cruelty of men. In that moment, protecting this boy became inextricably linked to honoring the memory of her own. It was a purpose, sharp and clear, rising from the ashes of her sorrow. "He has no one left," she said softly. Elias Vance looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a weary gratitude. "No, ma'am, he doesn't." Alara stood, her movements once again filled with resolve. She went to the hearth and gently stoked the fire, adding a fresh log. The flames licked at the new wood, growing brighter, pushing back the shadows. She looked at the sleeping boy, then at the Marshal. "He has us," she said. With the truth laid bare between them, the very air in the cabin seemed to change. The tense quiet of a sick room gave way to the low hum of purposeful activity. There was no discussion of what came next, no formal agreement made. There was only a shared, unspoken understanding that the outpost was no longer just Alara's refuge. It was their fortress, and they would defend it together. The first order of business was the chain. It lay between Elias and Daniel. A cold, dark serpent of iron, a symbol of a ruse that had served its purpose but was now an intolerable weight. "In the stable," Elias said, his voice still weak but clear. "Your husband's forge. There should be a cold chisel and a heavy hammer." Alara returned with the tools, their metallic scent sharp in the clean air. Elias, propped up against the wall, directed her with the calm precision of a man who understood the properties of metal and stress. "You'll need a solid surface. That flat stone on the hearth will do. Place the link right at the edge." Daniel sat silently, watching with wide, unblinking eyes as Alara positioned the chain. He held his own chained wrist with his free hand, as if bracing for a blow. "Easy, son," Elias murmured, his gaze soft on the boy. "We're taking it off now. You're free." Alara lifted the heavy hammer. The weight felt foreign in her hands, a tool of brute force, not healing. "Ready?" she asked, looking at Elias. He gave a single, firm nod. She brought the hammer down. The first strike rang through the cabin, a sharp, percussive sound that made Daniel flinch. The iron link dented but did not break. Again, she struck, putting the strength of her shoulders into it. A crack appeared. On the third strike, the link split with a loud crack, and the chain fell away in two pieces. The sound of the broken iron clattering against the hearthstone was the sound of liberation. Daniel stared at his wrist, now raw and chafed but free. He rubbed it slowly, as if reacquainting himself with his own body. A single, shuddering breath escaped him, the first sound of pure relief Alara had heard him make. Elias slumped back against the wall, his own relief so profound it seemed to drain the last of his energy. The physical bond was broken, replaced by something stronger, something chosen. In the days that followed, a fragile domesticity took root. Their lives became a braid of shared tasks and quiet companionship. Elias, though still recovering, began to direct the fortification of the way station. He saw the world through a Marshal's eyes, a landscape of angles and vulnerabilities. "That window gives a clear line of fire from the ridge," he'd say, pointing with a bandaged hand. "We need to board the bottom half." Alara, in turn, saw the outpost through the eyes of one who knew its every secret. "The boards on the north wall are soft from the winter winds," she'd counter. "They won't stop a bullet, but the floorboards here." She led him to a corner of the main room, near the large supply trunk. Using the pry bar from Samuel's tools, she lifted two heavy planks to reveal a dark, square opening. The original builders put in a storm cellar. It runs under the main room and connects to a small space beneath the stable. It's been a place for spiders and memories for 5 years. Now, it might be our lifeline. Elias peered into the dark, musty space, a slow smile of respect spreading across his face. "Mrs. Vincent," he said, the formal address sounding almost like a term of endearment. "You are full of surprises." They worked together, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. While boarding the lower half of the windows, they stood side by side, passing the hammer back and forth. Alara found herself speaking of her husband and son, not with the sharp, stabbing pain of fresh grief, but with a gentle, wistful sorrow that felt like a healing. Samuel put this window in himself, she said, running her hand over the frame. He said a person deserved to see the sunrise, even in Nebraska. He was a hopeful man. Hope is a rare commodity in my line of work, Elias replied, his voice low. I've spent most of my life moving through other people's towns, sleeping in other people's beds. Never really had a place to watch the sunrise from. The quiet confession hung in the air between them, a glimpse into a life of profound loneliness that mirrored her own. Daniel, in this new atmosphere of safety and shared purpose, began to emerge from the shell of his trauma. At first, he simply watched, a silent shadow flitting at the edges of their work. Then, he began to help in small ways. He would appear at Alara's elbow with a handful of nails, or bring Elias a dipper of fresh water without being asked. He still did not speak, but his eyes were alive with a new curiosity and a dawning sense of belonging. The turning point came one afternoon, as Alara sat alone on the porch, cleaning Samuel's old Winchester rifle. The weapon Elias had insisted she learn to use. The task was a painful one. The rifle smelled of gun oil and Samuel, a combination that brought a lump to her throat. She was so lost in the memory that she didn't notice Daniel until he stood directly in front of her. He held out his hand. In his palm lay the small, wooden bird she had mended. He had smoothed its rough edges and, using a piece of charcoal from the fire, had carefully drawn a tiny, seeing eye on its head. He pushed it into her hand, his small fingers closing hers around it. Then, just as silently, he turned and went back to his self-appointed task of stacking kindling by the door. Alara stared at the bird. It was more than a toy. It was a gift. A message. You fixed what was broken in me. I trust you. She closed her hand around it, the smooth wood warm against her palm, and felt tears well in her eyes. They were not the hot, angry tears of grief she had cried for 5 years, but tears of a different kind, a slow, warm, and cleansing rain. She was not just a keeper of grades. She was a mender of broken things. That evening, the three of them sat at the table, sharing a meal of rabbit stew. The fire crackled in the hearth, its light casting a warm, golden glow over the room. The fortifications were complete. The cellar was stocked with water and supplies. A fragile sense of peace had settled over the outpost. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet comfort of companionship. Elias looked from Alara to Daniel, a look of profound, weary gratitude on his face. He had arrived here a wounded man, chained to a broken child. Now, he sat at a table that felt, for the first time in his memory, like home. Alara met his gaze, and a small, genuine smile touched her lips. The outpost was no longer a tomb. It was alive with the steady, quiet work of 3 souls building a fortress, not just of wood and earth, but of trust. The first sign of the coming thaw was the sound of dripping water. It was a gentle, persistent rhythm, a stark contrast to the howling silence of the blizzard. Icicles that had hung from the eaves like jagged teeth began to weep, and dark patches of earth appeared on the sun-facing slopes, emerging from the snow-like islands in a white sea. The thaw was a promise of spring, of life returning to the prairie, but for the inhabitants of the Black Creek Way Station, it was a harbinger of danger. The melting snow meant the trails would soon be passable. Their sanctuary, once protected by the impassable drifts, would be exposed. The world they had held at bay was coming for them. The tension in the cabin grew with each degree the temperature rose. They took turns keeping watch, using the old brass spyglass Samuel had kept on the mantelpiece. It was on the 4th day of the thaw that Alara, her eye pressed to the lens, saw it. A dark speck on the distant eastern ridge, moving with a slow, methodical purpose. "Elias," she said, her voice low and steady. "We have a visitor." He came to stand beside her, taking the spyglass. He was stronger now, the wound in his shoulder healing cleanly, the gauntness in his face replaced by a lean strength. He focused the lens, his jaw tightening. "Just one rider," he said. "He's not coming directly. He's scouting the perimeter. He knows we're here, or suspects it." The scout's presence, a single, ominous figure against the vast landscape, shattered the fragile peace they had built. The threat was no longer a distant possibility. It was a shadow on their horizon, real and drawing closer. The work of fortification took on a new urgency. "It's time you learned to use this properly," Elias said that afternoon, taking Samuel's Winchester from its pegs on the wall. Alara's hands recoiled instinctively. She hadn't touched the rifle since the day she had cleaned it after Samuel's death, an act of final, loving duty before walling off that part of her life. The weapon was a relic, an extension of the man she had lost. To use it felt like a violation. "I can't," she whispered. Elias's gaze was gentle but unyielding. "You can," he said. "Silas Kane won't be coming here to talk. Alara, when his men ride in, they'll be coming to finish what they started. Daniel's life, and ours, will depend on every shot we can fire." He called her Alara now, the formal Mrs. Vincent, having dissolved in the shared work and quiet intimacy of the past weeks. He led her outside, into the stark, bright light of the thawing prairie. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and melting snow. He set up a row of tin cans on a fence post 50 yards away. The process of learning was a grim ballet. He showed her how to hold the rifle, how to brace the stock against her shoulder to absorb the kick, how to line up the sights, how to squeeze the trigger with a slow, steady pressure. "Don't think of it as a weapon," he told her, his hands briefly covering hers to adjust her grip. "Think of it as a tool, the only one we've left to protect this boy." Her first shot went wide, the recoil jarring her more than she expected. The loud report echoed across the silent prairie, a sound of violence that made her flinch. But with each subsequent shot, her hand steadied, her focus sharpened. The nurse in her, accustomed to precision and control, took over. She began to hit the cans. First one, then another, the metallic ping a small, satisfying sound of competence. Daniel had followed them outside, watching from the safety of the porch steps. The sound of the gunfire was a torment to him. With each shot, his small body tensed, his hands flying up to cover his ears. He retreated into himself, his eyes wide and dark with a remembered horror. It was on Alara's final shot, a clean hit that sent the last can spinning into the air, that the boy's fragile composure broke. As the rifle's report faded, a sound tore from his throat, a raw, guttural cry of pure terror. He dropped to the ground, curling into a tight ball, his body shaking with violent, silent sobs. Alara dropped the rifle as if it had burned her. The small victory of her marksmanship turned to ash in her mouth. She ran to the boy, kneeling in the mud beside him, gathering him into her arms. "It's all right, Daniel," she soothed, rocking him gently. "It's over. You're safe. I'm here." He burrowed his face into her shoulder, his small hands clutching her dress. She could feel the frantic beating of his heart against her own. Elias stood a few feet away, his face a mask of sorrow and helplessness. Alara looked past Daniel's shaking form, her gaze falling on the small, private graveyard on the rise behind the cabin. There were 2 graves there. One, larger and marked with a sturdy wooden cross for Samuel. Beside it was a smaller one, a simple mound of earth marked by a pile of carefully chosen river stones, where Leo lay. Daniel must have seen the graves during his quiet explorations, must have understood their meaning in a way only a child who has experienced profound loss can. He lifted his head from her shoulder, his face streaked with tears and mud. His gaze followed hers to the small cemetery. He pointed a trembling finger toward the smaller grave. And then, for the first time since Elias had found him in the root cellar, he spoke. His voice was a tiny, broken whisper, a sound that had traveled through an ocean of trauma to reach the air. "Leo," he said. The name, her son's name, struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. It was a collision of past and present so violent it stole her breath. This boy, this orphan she had taken in, had spoken his first word, and that word was the name of her own lost child. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, a recognition. In the simple, heartbreaking logic of a traumatized child, he had seen a small grave and given it the name of the loss that was at the forefront of Alara's own heart, a name he could only have learned by some miracle of perception. Elias took a step forward, his face etched with disbelief and awe. Alara held Daniel tighter, her tears now flowing freely, mingling with his. They were no longer the tears of a solitary griever, but the shared tears of a mother and a son who had found each other in the ruins of their lives. She looked up at Elias, her eyes shining with a fierce, unwavering resolve. The shadow on the horizon had a name and a face, but in this moment, Alara knew with absolute certainty that the small, fragile family they had forged in the heart of a blizzard would not be broken. The memory of the son she had lost had just given her the strength to fight for the one she had found. The lonely outpost was no longer a place of mourning. It was where hope would make its stand. They came with the first light, 5 riders moving out of the gray pre-dawn like ghosts given flesh. The sun was a pale, bloody smear on the eastern horizon, casting long, predatory shadows across the snow. Alara watched them from the stable's hayloft window, the Winchester's cold stock pressed against her cheek. Her heart was not a frantic drum of fear, but a slow, heavy, and purposeful beat. Inside the main cabin, Elias was at his post, his own rifle resting on the boarded-up window frame. Between them, in the dark, musty tunnel of the storm cellar, Daniel waited, a small, silent soldier with a sack of ammunition at his feet. They had rehearsed their plan in hushed whispers the night before, a trinity of defense bound by a desperate hope. "Stay calm until they commit," Elias had instructed, his voice low and steady. "They're arrogant. They'll expect us to be huddled in the main house. They won't be looking for a fight from 2 directions." The riders fanned out as they entered the clearing, their confidence a tangible thing. A tall, silver-haired man at their center, whom Alara knew instinctively was Silas Kane, gestured with a gloved hand. 2 men dismounted and moved toward the main cabin, rifles held ready. 2 others began a wide circle toward the stables. Kane remained on his horse, a king surveying his domain before its conquest. The men approaching the cabin were halfway across the yard when Elias's rifle cracked, the sound sharp and definitive in the cold air. The lead man cried out and crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg. The second dove for the cover of the well, firing blindly at the cabin window. At the same instant, from the stable, Alara took aim at one of the men circling toward her. She remembered Elias's words, "Squeeze, don't pull, breathe out." The world narrowed to the rifle's sight, the man's dark coat, and the space between heartbeats. She fired. The man staggered, spinning around with a look of pure shock on his face before collapsing into the snow. The crossfire had its intended effect. The remaining attackers were thrown into confusion, their confident advance shattered. They had expected a cornered animal, not a coordinated defense. Kane roared an order, his voice a furious bellow that cut through the sporadic gunfire. He and his remaining men took cover behind the frozen water trough and the woodpile, turning the yard into a no-man's land. The siege began in earnest. For the next hour, the small outpost was a hellish tableau of muzzle flashes and the splintering of wood. Bullets thudded into the log walls of the cabin and stable, a deadly rain against their small fortress. But their strategy was working. Pinned between 2 points of fire, Kane's men could not mount a focused assault. Their lifeline was Daniel, moving through the darkness of the cellar. He was the beating heart of their defense. He would appear at the bottom of the stable ladder, his small face pale but resolute in the dim light, holding up a fresh box of cartridges for Alara. Then he would scurry back through the tunnel to resupply Elias. He was fearless, driven by a purpose that had burned away his trauma. He was no longer a victim. He was a vital part of his own rescue. The tide turned when one of Kane's men, in a desperate attempt to flank the stable, exposed himself for a fraction of a second. Elias's shot was instantaneous and lethally precise. The man fell and did not move again. There were only 2 left now, Kane and one other, pinned down and running low on ammunition. "Vance!" Kane's voice boomed across the yard, raw with fury. "I know you're in there. Throw the boy out, and I'll let you and the woman live. My fight is with the witness, not you. You'll get nothing from us, Kane," Elias shouted back, "except a federal warrant for murder." In a final, desperate gambit, Kane's last remaining man broke from cover, making a frantic run for the cabin's porch, a lit torch in his hand. Alara saw him, tracked him, and fired. The man dropped the torch and fell, clutching his shoulder, his attempt to burn them out extinguished in the snow. Now there was only Kane. He was alone, crouched behind the water trough, a formidable figure of cornered rage. He fired shot after shot at the cabin, pinning Elias down. He knew one of his attackers was in the stable, but in the chaos, he hadn't yet pinpointed the exact location. Alara knew this was her moment. Elias was trapped. It was up to her. She rested the Winchester on the edge of the hayloft opening, the world shrinking to the space between her and Silas Kane. Her hands were steady, her breath even. The memory of Daniel's small, broken voice speaking her son's name was an anchor in the storm of violence. Leo, she was not just defending an outpost. She was defending a future, a promise. She could kill him. The shot was clear. A part of her, the grieving widow who had lost everything, wanted to. But the other part, the nurse who had sworn to preserve life, held her back. "You're a healer," a voice that sounded like Samuel's whispered in her heart. "Not a killer." She shifted her aim slightly, focusing not on his chest, but on the thick wooden trough he was using for cover. She took a deep, calming breath and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the trough with tremendous force. The frozen wood exploded, sending a high-pressure blast of icy water and splintered timber directly into Cain. He was thrown backward with a roar of shock and pain, his rifle flying from his grasp. In that instant, Elias burst from the cabin door, covering the distance in a few powerful strides. Before Cain could recover, the Marshal was on him, disarming him and binding his hands with a length of rope from the woodpile. It was over. The silence that fell was more profound than any sound. It was the silence of survival, of a storm that had finally passed. Alara slowly lowered the rifle, her arms trembling from the strain. She looked across the yard at Elias, who stood over his captured foe. He met her gaze, and in that look, 1,000 words were spoken, of gratitude, of respect, of a shared victory that had forged their souls together. She made her way down from the loft and out into the yard. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. The pristine snow was trampled and stained. Daniel emerged from the cabin, blinking in the bright morning light. He ran, not to Elias, but to her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her dress, and for the first time, she felt him shake with the aftershocks of what they had endured. She held him tight, her hand stroking his hair. Over his head, she saw Elias approaching, his face weary but his eyes shining. He stopped before them, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder and the other on hers. The three of them stood together on the scarred earth of the Black Creek way station as the sun climbed higher, flooding the prairie with a clean, golden light. The lonely outpost was lonely no more. It was a home, battered but not broken, where a family, born not of blood but of courage and compassion, had made its stand. And won.